Right then, brethren, if you were with us last week, we were in Daniel chapter 8. Quite an important chapter in many ways. It does seem to suggest what may lie just ahead of us as of right now. It's the story, if you remember, of the ram and the he-goat. The ram launches an attack, first and foremost, launching an attack to the north and to the south and to the west, and is victorious, conquers many countries in the Middle East. The ram being, of course, and we're told this in chapter 8, it is Iran or Persia. A bit later, the he-goat, the male goat, comes racing across from the west, attacks the ram, completely destroys it, tramples all over it, and it does appear that the he-goat from the west is Asia Minor, a coalition of 4 countries, largely led by Turkey. Turkey being a very powerful military nation as at the moment. So we see that in Daniel chapter 8. Then we saw that the he-goat has a notable horn, which is broken off, and then 4 new horns come up. 4 new sort of nations or countries or states. Perhaps they're rearranging the borders. And out of one of the 4, so new countries, new relationships, comes what's called a little horn in Daniel 8. It's a little horn, but it grows exceedingly and becomes arrogant and pompous, has a fierce countenance, and stands up and purports to be as good as the prince of the host of heaven. So here's a little horn, an individual who grows up and becomes so arrogant, he claims pretty much to be as good as Jesus Christ, if not even better. All right? We saw the little horn, as part of what he does is he stops the daily sacrifices in the Jewish temple, and he establishes the Abomination of Desolation. Now, Jesus warned us to understand the writings of the apostle or the prophet Daniel with regard to the Abomination of Desolation. This is one of the places in Daniel chapter 8. And the little horn stops the sacrifices, erects this Abomination of Desolation. We saw that the apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians refers to him as the man of sin, the son of perdition, who sits in the temple and shows himself to be every bit as good as Jesus Christ, the prince of the host of heaven, same sort of person. So what we know from Daniel chapter 8 is that you and I can keep an eye open for Iran. What is Iran up to? It's a pariah state even today. It's trying to develop nuclear weapons. There are severe sanctions against the country today, largely put in place by former President Mr. Trump. Suspicions are that Mr. Biden will probably ease those quite a bit, which in a sort of reverse way will probably encourage Iran to speed up, potentially, its nuclear program. So Iran is a difficult country right now today. It supports terrorism in other countries. They are Shia Muslims. They believe that they are the Muslim sect who should be taking over the world for Allah. So we can watch Iran. It's got all the ingredients, and Daniel 8 tells us at some point, whether it's this year or next year or 5 or 10 years away, it will launch these attacks, and that brings us all the way through to the little horn and all the rest of it. So a lot of stuff can happen there. We can also watch for the beginning of the Jewish sacrifices. Obviously, they're going to be stopped by the little horn, the Antichrist, the man of sin, but they have to start first. When will they start? We don't know for sure. They could start this year, right? It doesn't necessarily require a physical temple, although you do require a physical altar to have the burnt sacrifices on, the daily sacrifices, 2 a day, evening and morning.
2 a day.
And if there's going to be a altar with sacrifices in Jerusalem, there are a number of issues to consider. Ideally, if they're going to do the job properly as per the Bible, The Jewish leaders and elders and religious leaders and Levites and so on should be looking for a red heifer whose ashes will be used to purify the men and the equipment and so on. That's if they do it biblically. But the Jewish rabbis have created some wriggle room, which means they can, if they choose to do so, they can actually start sacrifices with an altar, but without a red heifer. So that's something to watch for. Red heifer, potentially. They are trying to find one. They've currently got 3 decent candidates for red heifers who are, blemish free. Any one of those might be good enough to slay, sacrifice, get the ashes, and then they're potentially off and running. Or they might choose to do it the non-biblical way. They are Jews after all. There is a bit of wriggle room there. So that's where we were last week in Daniel chapter 8. Today we're moving on to chapter 9, so let's open our Bibles there in Daniel chapter 9, also a very interesting chapter in many ways. Let's read verses 1 and 2. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he, God, would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So, Daniel's looking through the word of God that he has. In particular, he's got the writings of Jeremiah the prophet. And of course, so do you and so do I. This takes place in the first year of Darius. So you've got the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar has now come to an end, all right? And you're now into the Medes and the Persians. So you had the head of gold, that was Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. We've now moved into the chest and shoulders of silver. So Daniel's already lived through one complete transition from the head to the chest, right? Time's moving on. It's about 65 years at this stage-ish since Daniel was taken captive. He was a young man at the time, perhaps 15 years old, 16, 17, 18. 65 years-ish has now passed. Daniel's in his 80s. And he's looking at the words of Jeremiah. And he sees there a reference to 70 years of desolations respecting Jerusalem. All right? And so Daniel realizes that, hold on a second, I was one of the first captives. That was 65, 66, 67 years ago. If there are 70 years in the Word of God about the desolations of Jerusalem, they must be surely almost up. So Daniel's intrigued. Is the 70 years up? Is it time for a restoration to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple? That's what he's thinking. Well, hold your place there. But let's turn to Jeremiah 29 and read what Jeremiah had indeed written. So Jeremiah 29, we're going to read verses 1 and just 10 to 11, just dipping into it. Jeremiah 29, and what had happened here was, Jeremiah had prophesied for a long time. The Jews of Jerusalem and Judea had ignored him. They had opposed Jeremiah, ridiculed him, thrown him into a slime pit, and of course, God's word had come to pass. Jerusalem had been destroyed, the temple destroyed, and the people all carted off over the course of about 20, 25 years to Babylon, and hardly anybody would return. So the prophecies of Jeremiah were completely fulfilled. So Jeremiah is now writing a letter to those captives in Babylon to explain that, look, guys and gals, don't think you're coming back in another year or two. The false prophets in Babylon were saying that, this isn't going to last. This is only a temporary little blip. We're going to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild it all in the next, 5 minutes. And God says, Jeremiah, write a letter and tell them what to expect. They're not going back in 5 minutes or 5 months or 5 years or 50 years. Write and tell them. So this is the letter. Verse 1, now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem, from the ruins of Jerusalem, To the remainder of the elders who were carried away captive, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. Right? So the letter then goes into the details, but let's just pick up verses 10 and 11, because this is what Daniel had picked up on. For thus says the Lord, verse 10, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, or for Babylon, some translations say, I will visit you and perform my good word towards you and cause you to return to this place, to Jerusalem. For I know the thoughts that I think towards you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. One of the very popular phrases today. You see it on little placards and badges. Oh, God's got great plans for you and great success for you. Well, in some sense that can be true, but specifically this is to people in captivity. And what Jeremiah is saying is, guys and gals, you're in captivity, you're staying there. 70 years are going to pass before anybody goes back to Jerusalem. So get married, start businesses, have children, have grandchildren, settle down, pray for Babylon. You need to, because you need a peaceful land to grow up in and have your families and live in and prosper in. But, as verse 10 says, after 70 years, well, things can change. After 70 years, you may come back to this place, right? And that's what Daniel had picked up on. So let's go back to Daniel chapter 9. Now, although people could go back after 70 years, history shows us that not many did. The average Jew living in Babylon actually was quite comfortable there. You know, Babylon, or Persia as it now was under Persian rule, was a prosperous place. There were culture, there was money to be made. They had lands and homes and houses. The kids had been born there, the grandkids born there. So when the opportunity came to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild it, only a few tens of thousands did. The vast majority stayed in Babylon, including, of course, I think Queen Esther. She was still there, right? And so on. Anyway, let's pick up the story. So what we've got here in Daniel is that Daniel has been reading the prophecies of Jeremiah, and he's interested. He knows that almost 70 years has passed. So he understands the prophecy is about to come to pass somewhere in his immediate future, in his lifetime. And therefore he's interested in prophecy that relates to him. He perhaps also looked at other prophets, but the story here is Daniel's very keen to understand the prophecies that will affect him and his life. A bit like you and I. There's lots of prophecies, but the ones that tend to be of interest to us are the ones that are likely to affect us. So we're a bit like Daniel there, aren't we? We want to know the prophecies that will affect me in the next 5, 10, 15, 25 years. And equally, you can see that Daniel's not overly fussed about timing and dates. Some people don't like looking at dates in prophecy. Dangerous. We don't know the day or the hour, and so let's avoid all dates and all time periods. Well, Daniel didn't. He could see, there's 70 years mentioned in prophecy, and I think we're sort of a long way towards that 70 years. What does that mean? And of course, the book of Daniel, if you think about it, has lots of time periods. 1335 days, and times in half a time, and 1260 days. So nothing wrong with approaching dates and times responsibly, not taking more out of them than we should, but not ignoring them. Daniel didn't ignore these. And Daniel's been focusing up to now really on the 70 years that he thinks has just about elapsed. We're going to see in a few moments that God sent an angel to visit, the angel Gabriel, to come to Daniel and talk about not 70 years, but 70 weeks. A future 70 weeks. So it's going to sort of move, if you like, Daniel's vision from the past 70 years to the coming 70 weeks, which turns out to be 70 times 7 years. We'll get to that. Verse 3, Daniel 9. So he's seen the prophecies in Jeremiah, and he says, Then I set my face toward the Lord God to make request by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth and ashes. So what's interesting here is, Daniel sees the prophecies, but he actually now takes action. He's not sort of passive, just says, oh yeah, I can see the prophecies. Fascinating. Carry on about his business. He sees the prophecies. He sees there are some timing elements that might be relevant, and so he takes action. Not just a question of, well, let's be fatalistic, que sera, sera, what will happen, will happen. No, Daniel's going to go to God and actually ask God to do something. So you can think about how you and I approach prophecy. Just read it. Say, oh yeah, I've just read that prophecy. One day it'll come to pass. Because Daniel could have said, yeah, one day it'll come to pass. In the meantime, let's see what's on Netflix today, right? But Daniel says, no, wow, there's things here. I need to take this to God and deal with it. Verse 4, and I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession and said, O Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and mercy with those who love him and with those who keep his commandments, we have sinned and committed iniquity. We have done wickedly and rebelled, even by departing from your precepts and your judgments. Absolutely accurate statement. You can say that, of course, today.
Nobody will listen. Easily,
because our countries today have completely departed from God's commandments, have hardly any interest in them. Verse 6, neither have we heeded your servants the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings and our princes, to our fathers, and to all the people of the land. Jeremiah was one of them. He was rejected and thrown in jail. O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us shame of face as it is this day. To the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and all Israel, those near and those far off in all the countries to which you have driven them, because of the unfaithfulness which they have committed against you. Of course, actually, Daniel was a pretty good man. I mean, he was outstanding, but he's sort of representing, the people of Judea, the Jews, the folk of Jerusalem. He's just saying, look, yeah, no question, God, as a nation, we're a disgrace. We've completely ignored and rejected you, your word, all of your prophets and all of your seers, the ones that you rose up early and sent to us, we've rejected them. Not Daniel himself personally, but he's speaking on behalf of the nation. Verse 8, O Lord, to us belongs shame of face, to our kings, our princes, our fathers, because we have sinned against you. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in his laws, which he set before us by his servants the prophets. Yes, all Israel has transgressed your law and has departed so as not to obey your voice. Therefore the curse and the oath written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out on us because we have sinned against him. And of course, you'll know these, I think, anybody around the Church of God knows Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, the writings of Moses, which include the blessings and the cursings, right? You know them all fairly well. If you obey God and yield to him and heed his word, you'll be blessed in the country, in the city, right? If you go against God's ways, if you disobey him, you'll be cursed. Again, in the fields, in the city, and eventually you'll be taken captive into other nations. That's written there, it's plain. You would hear it quite often if you went to the temple or to the teachers in those days. Everybody knew the law of the blessings and the curses. It was there, well known, for centuries at this stage. And of course, God sent his prophets, one after another, the seers, one after another. They went to the kings, they went to the elders. They were ignored. The people paid no attention to God's warnings, to the writings of Moses centuries earlier. Verse 12. And he, God, has confirmed his words, which he spoke against us and against our judges who judged us, by bringing upon us great disaster. For under the whole heaven such has never been done as what has been done to Jerusalem, which lay in ruins. And of course, the beautiful Temple of Solomon, perhaps the finest building ever on planet Earth, burnt down in ruins, and all the utensils, the implements, the equipment taken away. As it is written in the law of Moses, verse 13, all this disaster has come upon us. Yet we have not made our prayer before the Lord our God, that we might turn from our iniquities and understand your truth. Even in captivity. Decades has passed. It's roughly 65 years since Daniel was taken captive, and the others have been in Babylon for decades. By the sound of it, they still aren't repenting. Therefore the Lord has kept the disaster in mind and brought it upon us. For the Lord our God is righteous in all the works which he does, though we have not obeyed his voice. And now, O Lord, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand, and made yourself a name, as it is this day, we have sinned. We have done wickedly. Well, to be fair, Daniel hadn't. But again, he's representing the people. He's not hiding anything. He knows the score. O Lord, according to all your righteousness, I pray, let your anger and your fury be turned away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy mountain. Daniel knows the prophecy. He knows that after 70 years, God has announced that he will open up the path back to Jerusalem. And so now he's saying, God, do it. Please, do it. Because of our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and your people are a reproach to all those around us. Now, therefore, our God, hear the prayer of your servant, that's me, Daniel, and his supplications, and for the Lord's sake, cause your face to shine on your sanctuary, which is desolate. It's not there any longer, just like it's not there today. O my God, incline your ear and hear me. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city which is called by your name, Jerusalem. For we do not present our supplications before you because of our righteous deeds, obviously not, but because of your great mercies. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and act. Do not delay for your own sake, my God, for your city and your people are called by your name. So, Daniel's doing a great job here. He's humbling himself on behalf of the people of God. He wants to see the prophecies of Jeremiah fulfilled. He wants to see Jerusalem rebuilt. He wants to know the people of God are back in the city of God, enjoying the word of God and prospering before God. He wants all these things. Daniel's an old man at this stage. He's somewhere in his 80s, right? He could have been quite sort of detached and just thought, well, I'm not going to go back. I'm 85 now. I won't be going back to Jerusalem. Not going to happen. If I did go back, it would just be ruins. I wouldn't get much out of it. He could have been detached, just ignored the issue. He could have thought, well, the Jews have got what they deserved. Stuff them, right? But he didn't. He loves God. He loves God's city. He loves the idea of God's sanctuary. He loves God's people. He wants the best for God's people. And if you think about the illustration there, Daniel's the person that you and I could sort of do with modeling ourselves on. It shouldn't be we should be keen to see the prophecies fulfilled in the right manner. We should be keen to see Jesus Christ on the earth, not just for us selfishly. Well, I don't want to have any trouble in the end time. I want to be hidden somewhere from all the troubles and be secure and safe and have lots of nice chocolate ice cream and apple crumble and custard and be completely safe and out of harm's way as long as I'm okay. Right? That's a bit selfish as an attitude. Daniel was very concerned for the people of God, for the name of God, for the reputation of God. And you and I shouldn't be people who are just uninterested in prophecy, apart from our selfish part of it. We should be saying, well, I'm all right. I know God's truth. I know about the Sabbath. I know about the holy days. I don't care about those sinners out there. They can rot in hell for all I care. Oh. That's not the sort of illustration of the example that Daniel set. You know, Daniel was honest. He was humble. But you can see he took action. You know, he prayed to God. He went in supplication to God. He fasted, dressed in sackcloth, humbled himself because he wanted, desired, hungered to see God's prophecies come to pass as soon as possible, right now, ideally, so that your name can be once again, lauded and praised. Oh, great God, please, because of your goodness, do this. Not because we deserve it, because Daniel knew they didn't deserve it. Just as you and I know that if God's going to give justice to this world, it's adios world, all right? You know, Daniel's familiar with Daniel 7, strangely enough, and he knows from Daniel 7 that he's got this fantastic vision of the Son of Man going in the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days to be given a kingdom which will be ruled forevermore with the saints of all nations under the whole heaven. He knows the vision of that eternal, everlasting kingdom of the Son of Man, right? And he knows that it's something to look forward to. He desires it, right? And you and I can do that as well. We know that's coming, and we could be enthusiastic about it, sort of strongly desire it. We can pray about it. Daniel didn't say, well, all these wicked Jews, they've got what God decreed, yeah, boo to them, right? So here's Daniel anyway. He's taking action as best he can, going to God, and he's focusing on the 70-year prophecy of Jeremiah, which he knows is sort of up. He knows Jerusalem is currently in desolations, and he knows that can now start to change. As it turns out, God's about to open Daniel's eyes and give him a much, much bigger picture. It's not the past 70 years, Daniel. It's the next 70 times 7 years you need to think about. And of course, the coming 70-week prophecy, as it's often called, does reflect on a yet future desolation of Jerusalem before the heavenly kingdom of Daniel 7 comes to pass. So let's read a bit about that. Daniel chapter 9, let's read verses 20 to 24. Now, while I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, Jerusalem, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, actually an angel, of course, the angel Gabriel, but looks like a man, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, or the former vision, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering, and he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. That's quite something. You go to God in prayer, in Daniel's case at least, and God says, Gabriel, head off down there, see Daniel and explain to him something that he needs to know, all right? And Gabriel says, by the way, Daniel, you're greatly beloved by Jehovah God in heaven. Good to know that, all right? And here starts this new vision with information that's going to be sort of key critical for Daniel to understand. Daniel's still focusing on the 70 years, which are about up, but actually that's nothing compared to the 77s that lie ahead. Verse 24, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. This is, of course, Jerusalem and the Jews of Judea and Jerusalem. 70 weeks, it says, are determined, and it's often referred to as Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. Now, if you've got a reference Bible or you got footnotes in your Bible, you'll see the word weeks there isn't actually weeks. It's the word Shabuah in Hebrew, S-H-A-B-U-A, Shabuah. In plural, In English we say Shabuas, I suppose. The Hebrews is Shabuim, but it means 7. So verse 24, 70 sevens are determined or appointed for your people and for your holy city, Jerusalem. 70 sevens. And that's understood by everybody, I think, to be 70 times 7 years. 70 sevens of years, so 490 years, right? 70 times 7, 490 years. So Daniel's looking at the 70 years of Jeremiah, and God says, no, it's actually 70 times 7 years. You need to think about it, Daniel. For your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy, either the most holy place or to anoint the most holy one. Right? So here's a reference to 70 times 7 years. 490 years are appointed or determined or cut off in respect of the city of Jerusalem and the Jewish people. And you can see, if you look at those verses there, there's reference to making an end of sins, bringing sins to an end, making reconciliation between the people who've always offended God and God, to bring in everlasting righteousness. So this does seem to be a reference to there will be 70 times 7 years up until the beginning of the kingdom of the Son of Man on the earth, right? When Jerusalem becomes the city of the great king of Daniel chapter 7. 70 times 7. I will see in a moment that it's not a continuous 70 times 7. It's not a continuous 70 weeks. It's a 7 and a 62 and a 1. Why? Well, we can see why. Verse 25. Know therefore, Daniel, and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, currently, of course, desolate and in ruins, so there's going to be a command from somebody to start rebuilding. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command, the decree, to restore and build Jerusalem again, until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Making, of course, if you're good at maths, 69 weeks, which comes out to 483 years. And they do appear to be one long period. The street of Jerusalem, presumably, shall be built again, and the wall of Jerusalem, even in troublesome times. And if you read through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you can see how much trouble there was when they were trying to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. There was lots of opposition, and they had to often sort of build bricks with one hand and have an axe or a sword in the other hand to defend themselves. There was a lot of trouble, right? But you can see there that from the going forth of this command until Messiah the Prince, there will be 69 weeks, which is 483 years, all right? When did the command go forth to restore and build Jerusalem? When did the decree get issued? When do you start counting the 483 years? Well, unfortunately, this is the Bible, so things aren't always crystal clear, right? And there are disputes. You know, the historians, the experts will say, well, it's that one there. No, it's not that. It's that one over there. Well, no, you're misreading it. It's actually this one over here. There are 4 possible announcements to rebuild the city and the temple and so on. And the one that seems to best fit, in my humble opinion, and Nebuchadnezzar's, is the decree of 457 BC, right? And that's a decree issued by King Artaxerxes I, right? That's mentioned in the book of Ezra. And if you start ARTA, Artaxerxes, Xerxes, Artaxerxes 1. There were 3 of them at least. This is the first Artaxerxes. And If that's the correct one in 457 BC, and you take your 483 years, as explained there, 69 Shabuas, it brings you to 27 AD, right? And that's the likely time when Jesus was baptized, right, in the Jordan. It's the likely time when Jesus' public ministry began. So it says it's 7 weeks and 62 weeks until Messiah the Prince. If that means until Messiah the Prince becomes publicly known, his public ministry starts, then that sort of makes sense. From 457 BC until 27 AD. Now, there are other dates, and you'll find, if you want to look into them, feel free. It's all a bit confusing. But some other people have other dates, and some say, well, it takes you to the time when Jesus arrived on Passion Sunday, as they often call it. There are other dates. What does seem to be the case is that back in the days of Jesus, back around about 20, 25, 30, 35 AD, lots of the Jewish scholars were familiar, of course, with Daniel chapter 9. And they could see here that, Messiah the Prince is going to come after these number of weeks. Well, that surely is about roughly, now. So actually many Jews in Jesus' day were looking for Messiah the Prince because they'd done the maths. They could see how it worked. And they, like us, might be sort of struggling with, is it that decree or this decree, right? So a little bit of a range, but they were expecting Messiah because the scriptures told them so, okay? I think in many ways, for you and me, it's not super important to know the exact date that Messiah the Prince came, because what's more relevant to us is the final week, the final 7 years, because that's yet ahead of us. That's the one that will affect us, knowing the exact date of Jesus' arrival, whether it was his public ministry or his rejection by the people or his crucifixion, depending on how you interpret this. That's of interest for sure. I'd like to know for sure and nail it down completely. But actually, it's not a big deal, ultimately. The big deal is the final week. That's the one that you and I might well experience. So that's, I think, where we put our attention. So verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Jesus' crucifixion, which wasn't for himself, it was obviously for our benefit. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. So here's a reference in verse 26 to the people shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, remember at this stage, when Daniel's writing, there is no city and no sanctuary, already destroyed. So Angel Gabriel's telling Daniel that in the future there will be a city and a sanctuary. It will be destroyed by the people of this guy, the prince who is to come, right? So somewhere in the future there is going to be the destruction of the city, the rebuilt city and the rebuilt sanctuary. Most people take that to be probably talking about 70 AD. Which is, I think, is certainly quite likely. That's the destruction of Jerusalem under General Titus. He was the Roman general in charge at the time, and the temple that Jesus had walked around, the temple that the Apostle Paul had visited, that temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and the city was destroyed, and roughly 1 million Jews were killed, which is a lot for the population of those days, right? And that took place about 70 AD and appears to be what's in mind here, right? Now, although it says here, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, was it the Romans who destroyed the city and the sanctuary? There's a reason for asking that question, I'll get to in a moment. The answer is no. The man in charge, General Titus, he was for sure a Roman. He became emperor a bit later. Josephus tells us that General Titus tried hard to stop the destruction of the temple, but the legionnaires were off their heads. They hated the Jews, despised the Jews. They went absolutely mad trying to get the gold from the temple, and General Titus and some of the top Roman generals and other soldiers tried to stop it, but they couldn't. The legions were absolutely, totally out of control. So it says here, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Who destroyed the city and the sanctuary? The answer is legions. 4 legions were involved. Military records, strangely enough, are actually quite good from these days. They're very detailed. The legions concerned, the 4 legions, were Legion 5, Legion 10, Legion 12, Legion 15. Only they use the Roman numerals. So it's Legion V for 5, Legion X for 10, Legion XII, and 15 Legion XV, right? So the 4 Roman legions who destroyed the city and the temple were not actually made up of Romans. If you think about it, Rome's a city in Italy. They can't have Romans all around the entire Roman Empire, fighting in wars and so on. There are a number of Romans at the top, but typically the Roman Empire, it used volunteers. When it went into places like North Africa, the Middle East, into Europe and so on, they brought in soldiers and military men and volunteers from wherever they were. It just made a lot of sense to use locals. So those 4 legions there, they know the makeup of those legions, and those 4 legions who destroyed the city and the temple were made up of Syrians, Egyptians, Arabians, and strangely enough, Bulgarians. Syrians, Egyptians, Arabians, and Bulgarians. You recognize they're all basically Muslim countries today. So the people, it says here, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city. The people who destroyed the city were Syrians, Egyptians, Arabians, and Bulgarians. And the prince who is to come will therefore come from those regions. So the prince who is to come, who we read about in the next verse, the prince who is to come comes from Arabia or Syria or Egypt, from a country that today is Islamic. The prince who is to come, right? And I've taken a time on that because some people say the prince who is to come will be a Roman. And somehow Roman becomes European and European becomes German, and hence you get back into the 4th empire of Daniel 7 is the Roman Empire. The legs of Daniel 2's statue is the Roman Empire. And here, because the people who destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD were Romans, the prince who is to come will be a Roman. And for Roman, we read European and German. The answer is no. If you check it all the way back, the people who destroyed Jerusalem were not Italians or Romans. They were guys from the Middle East. That's why they hated the Jews so much. That's why they went after the temple and burnt it down despite General Titus trying his best to protect it. They just hated the Jews. So let's move on to verse 27. Then, and here it goes, then he, this is the prince who is to come, right? Verse 26, the prince who is to come, blah, blah, blah. Then he, the prince who is to come, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. This is the final Shabuah, right? We had 7 Shabuahs, we had 62 Shabuahs or Shabuim. This is the last one, and it's right at the end, okay? Then he, the prince who is to come, shall confirm a covenant or a treaty with many for 1 Shabuah, meaning 1 7-year period, the last of the 7 years, the last of the Shabuahs. But in the middle of the week, if it's 7 year long, then in the middle is a 3.5 year point, right? After 3.5 years, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. I think we recognize, put a stop to the sacrifices, yeah? And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate or desolator. So verse 27, we've got this he, the prince who is to come, who will make a covenant with many or a majority for 1 7-year period. And in the middle of that period, after 3.5 years, in other words, there's some sort of double cross. So he makes this covenant, this treaty, this agreement for 7 years. But 3.5 years into it, at the midpoint, he does the dirty. There is a double cross. This is the man of sin. This is the little horn. This is the Antichrist, right? This is all those nasty terms we've come across. And he's making what might come across as a sort of peaceful treaty for this 1 week period. It's often referred to as Daniel's 70th week, but understand it doesn't mean a week of days. It's a 7-year period of Shabuah. And verse 27 tells us that halfway through the 7 years, he stops the sacrifices, brings it to an end. And it talks about on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. That's a little bit awkward to read in the New King James Version. So here's a couple of other translations that I think might make it a wee bit clearer. What it's talking about, summarizing, it's the abomination of desolation. Jesus told us about it, and we now know it's going to be at the midpoint of Daniel's 70th so-called week. 7-year treaty, 7-year covenant. Halfway through that, 3.5 years, we have the sacrifices being stopped. Of course, once they've started, and this abomination who desolates. Other translations, the Greek Septuagint, the English version of it, it says, and upon the temple shall be an abomination of desolations. And at the end of time, an end shall be put to the desolation. So upon the temple, abomination of desolations. We've read that in Daniel 8. Here we are in Daniel 9. The New International Version, a nearly inspired version, says, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So you can have a look at other translations. So Daniel 9:27 is telling us what I think we already know quite well. 7 years, halfway through it, abomination of desolation, and sacrifices stopped. I think we're quite familiar with that. Now that final 7 years is going to be a pretty interesting period. And that's why I said earlier, if we want to spend any time sort of researching and digging in, probably that final 7 years is going to be a bit more relevant to you and me than exactly when Messiah the Prince arrived first time round, depending on which of the 4 decrees you go with and so on and so forth. Interesting. I'd certainly love to know the exact answer because I'm curious that way. But what matters is the final week, the final Shabuah, because that's going to be very interesting, right? We know the halfway point, the abomination of desolation and sacrifice is stopped. Do you think we'll spot the beginning of the 7 years? Right? Verse 27 says, he, this prince who is to come, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Right? Will we see that? Will it be public? Will it be done, behind the scenes, in private, so confidentially? Don't know for sure. We certainly will notice the halfway point, because once the sacrifices, which have been going on for a while, are stopped and this abomination starts, we'll certainly recognize that. Jesus told us, when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then if you're in Judea, get out. We'll certainly see that if we're awake. Will we see the beginning of the 7 years? My speculation, is probably yes. I think we probably will. At least approximately, not necessarily to the day, right? I mean, we might. I'm not saying we won't. I'm just saying I think there's a good chance we'll spot the beginning of the 7 years, the final 7 years, because like I've said before, and this is, of course, speculation. I believe that each of the 7 years at the end, each of the final 7 years corresponds with the opening of one of the 7 seals of Revelation chapter 6. Right? You may have forgotten that, but I did say that at the time. So therefore, in the first year of Daniel's 70th so-called week, year 1, I believe corresponds with the opening of the first seal of Revelation 6, which is the rider on the white horse who goes out to deceive. So I believe the white horse rider, the great deception, starts in year 1 of the final 7. And then obviously the next one, in year 2 of the final 7 years, you've got the red horse. The rider goes out making war, and so on. All right? That's speculative. Might work out that way. Might not. That's what I'm thinking. Now, if you've grown up in the Worldwide Church of God or the Church of God, you actually won't find much about this covenant with many for 1 week and the Abomination of Desolation halfway through it. There's not much at all in the old Worldwide Church of God literature. Mr. Armstrong himself avoided it. I checked that out at one point, the guy who baptized me. The minister, I should say, the minister who did the Daniel 8 description I mentioned last week, he could see the ram being Persia. He could see the reference to Greece being the he-goat. He could see the references again and again and again to end time, end time, end time. And I remember, like I said to you, he took this Bible study and he says, I can't figure this out at all, he said. It's quite evidence in end time prophecy, Daniel 8. He said, and I can see reference to Persia, which it was actually still called that back in 1974, 75. I can see Greece, but he says Greece is a tiny little country. Apart from people going there on holiday and so on, it's totally unimportant. How can that possibly fulfill end-time prophecy? But he was very close. If you just understood that Greece wasn't a good translation of the Hebrew, Javan or Yavan, and Asia Minor and Turkey, much better, much more likely description, he would have been very, very close. But that's the guy. I wrote to him once and I said, look, I'm trying to figure out Daniel 9:27, which this was 20 plus years ago. I said, did Mr. Herbert Armstrong ever go into it? And he wrote back and said, no, Mr. Armstrong scrupulously avoided it because he wasn't at all convinced he understood it, so therefore he just avoided it entirely. And that's probably a good thing to do in some ways. However, you'll find some references in Worldwide Church of God literature to Daniel 9:27, the first part at least. And I don't think it makes much sense, right? It's not just the Worldwide, there's a few other groups in there as well. And what they tend to do is verse 27. So this is the alternative that you might have grown up with, and I'll just mention it in passing. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he'll bring an end to sacrifice. The traditional explanation of that from Church of God quarters is that he is Jesus Christ. He is the Prince who is to come. He's referred to as Messiah the Prince back in verse 25. So, you can sort of see Messiah the Prince, and then we sort of creep forward to verse 27 and we shoehorn in Jesus Christ, the Messiah, as the Prince who is to come. And the covenant he will confirm with many for 1 week, for 7 years, is the new covenant. Well, I believe this, so maybe you believe it as well. It makes sort of vague sense, of course, that Jesus Christ is the Prince. Yeah, we can see that. And the covenant, it's going to be the new covenant for sure. And he's going to confirm it with many, lots of people for 1 week. Odd that. I'm not quite sure what the 1 week is. But then you'll be told, if you read these old articles, I think Bill Dankenbring was one of the authors way back in the 60s. The 1 week is a 7-year period. We can see that part. So Jesus will confirm the new covenant with many for 7 years. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice. Oh, Jesus will be sacrificed halfway through that 7 years. And he was sacrificed on a Wednesday, halfway through the physical week. So therefore, nod, wink, wink. So for sure, we're onto strong ground here, right? And Jesus is a sacrifice that brings an end to sacrifice. Yeah, okay, I'm sort of just about with you there. And that's it, right? So, so what happened halfway through the week? Oh, right, okay. And then the thinking is, well, Jesus will confirm the new covenant for 7 years. And the first half of that, up to the midpoint, Jesus did in person with his personal ministry. As he went around Galilee and walked over the sea and went down to Jerusalem. And that was the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus, you see. That's the first half, right? Okay, now the catch here is, who says Jesus' physical ministry was 3.5 years? It would have to be if you're going to try and apply this to Jesus. But was Jesus' physical ministry 3.5 years? Do you know that? Can you find it in the gospel accounts? You can't. Now, it's popularly believed that Jesus' physical ministry was 3.5 years. A lot of people believe that, but not everybody. Top scholars, New Testament scholars, many will say, Jesus' ministry was closer to 2 years in duration. 2. Top scholars at top, theological colleges and so on, 2 years. Many say 3 years, I think. I think 3 years was more likely. A number say 3.5 years. I've seen it as low as 70 weeks, strangely enough. Interesting number. And I saw once somebody said it was 15 years in duration. But the point is that, who says 3.5 years, right? The gospel accounts are quite ambiguous at times, and you're not sure if it's the same event being mentioned by different writers at the same time or not. So, scholars don't know. It's between, I think, between 2 years and 3.5 years. I think 70 weeks is too short, but some people say that was the length of Jesus' physical ministry. It was like the 70-week prophecy, type and antitype. They say Jesus was a 70 weeks ministry. Well, I don't personally see that, because you have to dismiss a certain verse in the book of John to get 70 weeks, but you can do it. I'm not convinced. 2 years to 3.5 years, yeah. The majority, probably 3 years. So, but that would make Daniel 9:27 not refer to Jesus, because if you're telling me Jesus was killed at the halfway point, halfway through his confirming the covenant, and it wasn't 3.5 years after all, then that doesn't work, right? The other catch you've got, if you want to go down this route, is that, okay, sake of argument, Jesus' physical ministry, we can't prove it, but we're going to assume it was 3.5 years. So the first half of the 7. What's the second half? Where's the next 3.5 years? If Jesus is confirming the new covenant for 7 years, and we're going to accept, for the sake of the argument, that Jesus' physical ministry was 3.5 years, what about the other 3.5 years? What's that all about? Where's that go? Where's that fit? And the answer, of course, is nowhere obvious. The 3 speculative ideas that I've come across. One is that, once Jesus went to heaven and ascended to heaven, then the apostles went out confirming the covenant with lots of Jews for another 3.5 years, up until the martyrdom of Stephen, and then they ran off and didn't any longer. And that was the 3.5 years. Yeah, that's still the 3.5 years of Jesus confirming the covenant. Doesn't sound terribly plausible, because the New Testament church continued to preach the gospel for decades thereafter. Peter, the Apostle Peter, was the apostle to the circumcision. He was the apostle to the Jews, and he was still preaching to the Jews up until his death, somewhere in the 60s AD, right? So if you're going to say that the second half of Jesus' 7-year ministry was the apostles preaching to the Jews for 3.5 years before something happened, no, makes little sense to me. The other 2 ideas are even less sensible. And one is that, once we get to the place of safety, if there is such a place, then once we're in the place of safety of 3.5 years, Jesus will, sort of do things to help and confirm. That's the other 3.5 years in the place of safety. You might remember, some of you, Mr. Gerald Waterhouse, infamous for his extremely long messages, resulting in lots of derrieres being completely frozen and paralysed, as he went on for hour after hour after hour. But Gerald Waterhouse referred to the place of safety as the place of final training. So for 3.5 years, you'd be in the place of final training, hiding under a rock and avoiding scorpions, whilst you would be finally trained. And so the confirming of the covenant is in the place of safety. Oh, so many flaws with that. And the third idea, I think the only other one that I've come across at least is, it's the first 3.5 years of the millennium. So Jesus had 3.5 years and then he was killed, crucified. When the millennium starts, Jesus will take the remaining 3.5 years of Daniel 9:27, and for the first 3.5 years in the millennium, Jesus will do stuff to confirm the covenant. Really, honestly, I can't see any merit in any of those ideas. To me, the simple reading of Daniel 9:27 is the prince who is to come will be the man of sin, the Antichrist. He'll confirm a covenant with many, a majority, for 7 years. He'll double-cross people in the middle of that. He will cancel the sacrifices. He will set up the abomination. And that's a sign that Jesus said, you and I can clearly see. When we see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, if you're in Judea, out pronto. That's going to be a plain, clear sign to the believers. And we might even see the beginning of the 7 years. I think there's a fairly good chance. So I think it's much better to go with the plain reading of Daniel 9:27, plain at least to me and my friend Nebuchadnezzar, rather than sort of the rather vague idea that this is something to do with Jesus' personal ministry, which might have been 3.5 years, 2,000 years ago, another 3.5 years floating around somewhere in the millennium or place of safety. That's of no help at all, quite honestly. So I think you and I, if we've got eyes to see and ears to hear, we can look for the fulfilment of Daniel 9:27 at the midpoint of the final 7 years, Daniel's 70th week, and that'll be a real, clear, plain, you cannot miss it warning. So let's be ready for that. Okay, and with that, we'll conclude today's Bible study.